Hi, I'm Emma. Welcome to Hidden Finance. If you're earning more than ever but still feel like you're standing still, you're not alone. Here, we uncover the quiet systems shaping your money, income traps, rising costs, lifestyle inflation, and the hidden psychology that keeps even high earners feeling stuck. No hype, no shortcuts, just clear thinking and practical strategies that actually move the needle. If you're ready to stop reacting to money and start directing it, this is where we begin. There is a kind of exhaustion that never shows up on medical charts. It does not come from lifting heavy things. It comes from waking up on a Tuesday and realizing that life has become a loop of invoices, notifications, and silent negotiations with yourself. The rent clears, the groceries are paid for, the card statement arrives, a paycheck lands, and before it can feel like progress, it is already being divided into pieces with other people's names on it. For a while, many people call this adulthood, but deep down, something feels off. There is a person we might call the decorated prisoner, not poor enough to be pitied, not wealthy enough to breathe. This person has a decent salary, a respectable routine, maybe even a polished desk, a subscription or two, clothes that signal competence, and a phone full of finance content saved for later. From the outside, nothing appears broken, yet every month still ends with the same private sentence. Why does so much effort create so little freedom? That question usually arrives quietly, not during a crisis, not after some dramatic collapse. It arrives while stirring coffee before work, or while looking at an account balance after a long day, or while noticing that a portfolio moved more in one afternoon than a body earned in 8 hours. And that is when the first crack appears. Because most people were taught to measure progress in income, not in independence. A higher salary sounds like rescue. A promotion sounds like relief. A bonus sounds like momentum. But salary can increase while peace does not. Income can rise while the feeling of being owned becomes sharper. Sometimes the treadmill does not slow down when earnings go up. It simply becomes more expensive to step off. That is the humiliation very few people name out loud. A person can be doing well on paper and still feel economically cornered. Not because they are irresponsible, not because they are lazy, but because modern life is strangely skilled at turning every gain into a new obligation. A better apartment becomes a larger payment. A nicer car becomes a longer leash. A raise becomes permission to spend. And spending quietly builds a life that requires constant maintenance. This is how dependency dresses itself as success. And somewhere in that cycle, another character begins to emerge. The hunter of exit. This person has not escaped yet. They still work, they still worry, they still sometimes buy things for comfort, status, or temporary anesthesia. But they have started to suspect something radical. The real problem may not be that work is hard. The real problem may be that life has been designed to require too much of it. This is where the idea changes everything. There are not just paychecks and bills. There are two invisible lines moving through a life. One line is the cost of staying alive in the chosen lifestyle: housing, food, transport, insurance, convenience, entertainment, habits, identity. The other line is the quiet output of invested money: dividends, interest, appreciation, the slow machinery of capital learning to move without permission. In the beginning, that second line looks laughable, tiny, almost insulting. A few dollars here, a small fluctuation there, nothing that feels powerful, which is exactly why most people ignore it. They keep serving the first line and starving the second. They feed expenses as if they are fixed laws of nature, while treating investments like an optional hobby for some wiser future self. But what if the future begins the moment those two lines are noticed? What if the real turning point in a financial life is not when someone earns more, but when someone finally understands that freedom has geometry? And if that is true, then the most dangerous purchase was never the expensive object. It was the life that made that object feel necessary. The second stage rarely begins with motivation. It begins with embarrassment. Not public embarrassment, the private kind. The kind that shows up when someone finally sits down with 3 months of bank statements and sees the shape of their life without the flattering story wrapped around it. This is where the decorated prisoner meets the mirror. Not the mirror of appearance, the mirror of behavior. And behavior is cruelly honest. The totals do not care how hard someone works. They do not care how deserved a purchase felt. They do not care that the delivery order came after a training week or that the upgrade looked reasonable compared to everyone else's standards. The numbers reveal something more uncomfortable. Many people are not trapped by one catastrophic financial mistake. They are trapped by 1,000 small expressions of fatigue, imitation, and emotional hunger. A larger apartment to feel established, a newer car to feel less behind, subscriptions bought during optimism and forgotten during routine, convenient spending that quietly becomes identity, little luxuries that say, "At least let me enjoy something," while slowly extending the years that must be sold to maintain them. This is the moment when finance stops being a spreadsheet topic and becomes psychological archaeology. Because beneath every recurring expense, there is often a hidden sentence. I need this to feel normal. I need this to look successful. I need this because everyone around me seems to have it. I need this because work takes so much from me that I deserve compensation. And yet, compensation is not the same as restoration. That distinction changes everything. Many people do not spend because they are irrational. They spend because they are depleted. They are trying to purchase relief from a life structure that is already too demanding, which is why the breakthrough is not merely spend less. That advice is too thin to survive reality. The deeper shift is this. We often buy things we do not deeply need, with money that has not had time to become free, in order to soothe pressures that the purchase cannot actually solve. Once that truth lands, the mathematics becomes strangely emotional. If monthly living costs are $4,000, then yearly life costs $48,000. Using the classic 4% framework, that means roughly $1.2 million invested is needed for work to become optional. At first, this number sounds almost insulting, too large, too distant, too detached from ordinary life. But then another realization enters. The target is not fixed in the way people assume. If life costs $3,000 a month instead, the number falls to about $900,000. If life costs $2,000 a month, it falls again. And if investing rises at the same time, the distance does not shrink slowly, it begins to collapse faster than expected. That is when the story becomes dangerous in the best possible way. Because now the question is no longer, will freedom ever happen? The question becomes, how much of this timeline is being extended by choices that no longer match who I am? This is where the hunter of exit becomes more disciplined. Not colder, not joyless, just harder to impress. A cheaper life is no longer seen as deprivation. It starts to resemble leverage. A lower monthly cost is not merely a smaller bill, it is fewer years owed. Every recurring expense cut removes pressure from the present and lowers the amount the future must generate forever. And every dollar invested begins to feel less like sacrifice and more like hiring a silent worker that never sleeps. That is the first real shift in power. Not wealth, not retirement, not perfect discipline. Just the moment when a person stops asking money to decorate their cage and starts asking it to build their exit. But once someone sees that each purchase may be costing future time, a more unsettling question appears. How many years have already been traded away for comfort that did not even last? There is a phase that almost no one talks about, not because it is rare, but because it is subtle. Nothing dramatic happens. No sudden windfall, no life-changing promotion, no external signal that anything has fundamentally shifted. And yet, something has. It begins quietly, somewhere between the early struggle and the distant dream. Often when invested capital reaches a point where fluctuations stop feeling symbolic and start feeling real. Maybe it is $50,000, maybe $80,000, maybe $100,000. The exact number does not matter. What matters is the moment when money stops behaving like a static object and starts behaving like a living force. A 2% movement is no longer abstract. It is hundreds, then thousands. A single day in the market can now echo louder than hours of labor. And for the first time, a strange realization surfaces. Effort is no longer the only source of progress. This is where the identity begins to fracture, because until this point, life was built on a simple equation: work equals income, time given equals money received. But now, there is another system running in parallel. Money begins to generate outcomes without direct supervision. It moves, it compounds, it reacts to forces beyond personal effort. And this creates tension, not external tension, internal tension. Because if money can work, then what exactly is the role of work? This is where many people experience what could be called the freedom gradient. Freedom does not arrive like a switch. It does not flip from trapped to free overnight. It leaks in. First, in small, almost dismissible ways. An investment portfolio covers a monthly subscription, then a utility bill, then groceries, then transportation. Each step seems insignificant, but psychologically, something profound is happening. Dependence is weakening, not eliminated, just loosened. And with that loosening comes a new kind of confidence. Not loud confidence, not performative success, a quieter kind. The ability to say no, the ability to pause before reacting, the ability to walk away from things that once felt mandatory, because survival is no longer fully tied to immediate output. This is when people begin to notice something unsettling about their past decisions. Many of the things that once felt necessary start to look negotiable. The expensive habit, the oversized commitment, the lifestyle standard that required constant maintenance. They were not always essential. They were reinforced, built slowly through repetition, comparison, and the need to keep up with an invisible script. And now, with a portion of life no longer requiring constant payment, that script starts to lose authority. But this stage is fragile, because the numbers are not yet large enough to guarantee safety. The crossover has not happened. The lines have not yet met, which means the temptation to retreat is strong, to sell during downturns, to panic when the portfolio drops, to revert to the old belief that only earned income is real. This is where most people break, not because the math failed, but because the psychology did. Markets will fall. They always do. Sometimes 20%, sometimes 30%, sometimes more. And during those moments, it will feel as if progress has been erased. But the truth is quieter than fear. When the system is still in the accumulation phase, falling prices are not destruction. They are acceleration in disguise. Because the same money now buys more future. And this is the part few people fully accept. Consistency matters more than timing. Endurance matters more than intelligence. The people who eventually reach the point where money works harder than they do are rarely the most brilliant. They are the ones who stayed, who kept buying when it felt pointless, who kept investing when it felt slow, who understood that the curve does not reward impatience, because the curve is not linear, it bends, and when it bends, it changes everything. But if the system is already beginning to produce momentum on its own, a deeper question emerges. At what point does continuing to push become optional rather than necessary? There is a concept that sounds almost unreal at first. Not full freedom, not complete independence, something in between. A quiet checkpoint where the future is no longer uncertain, even if the present still requires participation. This is what some call the coasting phase, the point where enough has already been built that time itself can finish the job. Imagine this. A person reaches a portfolio size where, even if they never invest another dollar again, compound growth alone will carry them to their final number. Not quickly, not instantly, but inevitably. This is where the relationship with work changes in a way that cannot be reversed. Because now, work is no longer the engine of survival. It becomes a tool, optional in intensity, flexible in form, negotiable in purpose. And this is where a subtle but powerful shift occurs. People stop asking, "How much can I earn?" and start asking, what kind of life do I actually want to live while this grows? This question is dangerous because it exposes something many have avoided for years: the realization that the current lifestyle may not have been chosen consciously. It may have been assembled, piece by piece, expectation by expectation, upgrade by upgrade, until it became something that required constant effort just to sustain. But now, with time on their side, people begin to experiment. Less pressure, more intention. Some reduce working hours, some change careers entirely, some pursue work that pays less but aligns more closely with who they are. Not because they have made it, but because they no longer need to squeeze every drop of income out of every hour. And that is where the illusion begins to collapse. The illusion that more money always equals more freedom. Because in many cases, more income simply funded a more demanding life, a life that required even more income to maintain, a loop. But once the underlying math is secured, that loop can be broken, and something else becomes visible. Every financial decision is no longer just a transaction. It is a trade, not between money and objects, but between time and autonomy. A $1,000 expense is no longer just $1,000. It is future output, future compounding, future optionality reduced. And this awareness does not make life restrictive. It makes it precise. Because now spending becomes intentional rather than reactive. A purchase must justify not just its price, but its cost in delayed freedom. And investing becomes something else entirely. Not a chore, not a discipline exercise, but an act of quiet rebellion against dependency, against urgency, against the idea that life must always be exchanged hour by hour for survival. This is the stage where something almost poetic happens. Money is no longer used to prove worth. It is used to remove pressure. And the person who once felt trapped begins to experience something unfamiliar. Space. Space to think, space to choose, space to exist without constant negotiation. But even here, before the final crossover, one last question lingers. If work is already becoming optional in pieces, then what exactly has been keeping it mandatory all along? There is no ceremony when it happens. No applause, no notification, no moment where the world pauses to acknowledge that something irreversible has just taken place. It is just another day, a random morning, coffee cooling slightly on the table, a quick glance at numbers almost out of habit, and then a pause. Not because the number is shocking, but because of what it means. For the first time, the output from invested capital quietly exceeds the cost of living. Not dramatically, not overwhelmingly, just enough. Enough to cover rent, enough to handle food, enough to sustain life without requiring a fixed exchange of time. And in that moment, something internal shifts. Not excitement, something deeper. Relief. Because for years, life was structured around a single assumption, that survival must always be earned daily, that time must always be traded, that effort must always be continuous, that stopping, even briefly, would cause everything to collapse. But now, that assumption breaks. And when it breaks, the mind does something unexpected. It does not immediately chase luxury. It does not rush toward excess. It becomes quiet. Because the real reward was never consumption, it was permission. Permission to choose, permission to step back, permission to ask questions that were previously too dangerous to consider. Questions like, what would life look like without urgency? What would work feel like if it were not required? What decisions would change if income were no longer the primary constraint? And perhaps the most uncomfortable question of all, if freedom was always a mathematical possibility, why did it take so long to notice? This is where the story becomes honest. Most people do not fail because they lack intelligence. They do not fail because they never had access to money. They fail because the system they live in is designed to keep the lines apart, to keep expenses rising quietly, to normalize constant upgrades, to encourage spending as identity, to blur the difference between comfort and dependence. And over time, this creates a life where every dollar earned is already assigned a destination. Nothing accumulates, nothing compounds, nothing escapes. Just movement. Endless movement. Until years pass and the realization arrives too late that the absence of intention is not neutral, it is expensive. But for those who see the lines early, everything changes because the path is no longer vague, it is measurable. Monthly expenses become a lever, not a burden. Investments become workers, not numbers. Time becomes visible, not assumed. And slowly, quietly, the gap closes. Not in a straight line. There will be setbacks, there will be doubt, there will be periods where progress feels invisible, but the direction becomes irreversible. Because once someone understands that every expense either delays or accelerates freedom, and every invested dollar permanently contributes to independence, it becomes impossible to go back to unconscious living, not because of discipline, because of clarity. And clarity has a strange effect. It simplifies. A smaller life intentionally chosen can feel larger than a complex one maintained for appearance. A lower cost can feel like higher power. A slower path can feel like faster escape. And eventually, the math completes itself. The lines cross. Work becomes optional. Time becomes negotiable. And the person who once felt like they were running endlessly finally understands something that was never taught in school. Money was never just about survival. It was about reclaiming the right to decide how life is lived. And once that truth is seen clearly, it cannot be unseen.